What could make 9 trained hikers slice open their own tent and run into a Siberian blizzard without their shoes? 60 years later, nobody has an answer. And by the end of this video, neither will you. In the final week of January 1959, 9 hikers walked into the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. And not one of them walked back out. They weren't amateurs chasing a thrill. They weren't a group of college kids who'd underestimated the wilderness. Every person on this trip was a seasoned outdoorsman, most of them students or recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute in the city of Sverdlovsk, a school known for producing some of the toughest, most capable hikers in the entire Soviet Union. All of them already held a Grade 2 hiking certification, one rank below the highest distinction the Soviet sporting authorities handed out. This expedition, a brutal 3-week traverse through the dead of a Ural winter, culminating in an ascent of a mountain called Otorten, was supposed to be the final qualifying trip that would earn them Grade 3 status. For some of them, it would have been the crowning achievement of years of hiking together. Because that's the other thing worth understanding about this group before anything else. They weren't strangers thrown together for a single trip. Most of them had hiked together for years. They trusted each other. They had survived storms, frostbite, broken equipment, and every other hardship the Urals could throw at a winter expedition. And they had always come home. Discipline mattered to this group. Before setting out, they left behind alcohol and cigarettes, determined to keep their minds sharp and their bodies focused for what they knew would be a serious physical test. The trip was led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an engineering student known among his peers as careful almost to a fault. The kind of leader who double-checked gear, who planned routes with margin built in for bad weather, who was already at such a young age deeply respected by everyone who hiked with him. Under his leadership were 8 others: Zinaida Kolmogorova, a bright and well-liked young woman known for her warmth; Lyudmila Dubinina, fiercely independent and outspoken; Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, 2 close friends who shared not only a first name but a long hiking history together; Alexander Kolevatov, quieter, more reserved than the others; Rustem Slobodin; Nikolai Thibault Brignol, an engineer with a touch of French ancestry in his name; and Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest of the group at 37, a war veteran who had joined this particular expedition somewhat late, and under circumstances that still strike some researchers as a little unusual for a man with his experience to attach himself to a group of much younger students. A 10th hiker started the journey with them, 21-year-old Yuri Yudin. He would be the only one of the 10 to come home alive. Just a single day into the trek, Yudin's body began to fail him. He had a long history of joint and kidney problems, and somewhere on that first brutal stretch of trail, the pain became unbearable. He knew, with the kind of clear-eyed honesty that good hikers develop, that pushing forward would only slow the rest of the group down, and possibly put all of them at greater risk. So he made the hardest call of his young life. He said goodbye to his friends, watched them shrink into the white distance with their packs and skis, and turned back toward home, with no idea that this small, painful, frustrating setback had just saved his life. Before the group split, Igor Dyatlov made Yudin one promise. The moment they returned to civilization, he would send a telegram to let everyone know they'd made it back safely. Yudin estimated the full out-and-back journey would take somewhere around 2 weeks. Maybe a few days longer, given how unpredictable Ural weather could be in February. The telegram never came. At first, nobody panicked. Delays were common on trips like this. Storms could easily add several days to a return journey, and seasoned hikers like Dyatlov's crew were not the kind of people anyone expected to get into serious trouble. But as January slipped into February, and February dragged on without word, the silence started to feel wrong. Friends and family pressed the university. The university, in turn, finally authorized a search. What followed was one of the largest search and rescue efforts the region had seen. Volunteer student groups combing the foothills first, followed by university staff, then police and eventually military units and even aircraft, scanning the white expanse for any sign of 9 missing hikers. For days, they found nothing. Then, on February 26th, a search party located the tent. It was pitched on the open, exposed slope of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kolat Shakal. In the Mansi language, the name translates chillingly to Dead Mountain, a name that long predated this tragedy, tied to old local legends about the place, but one that would take on an entirely new and darker meaning after this expedition. What the search team found at that tent did not make sense, and it still doesn't, more than 60 years later. The tent had been cut open, not unzipped, not untied at the entrance the way you'd expect from someone leaving in a hurry but still in control of themselves. Cut, sliced through the canvas with a knife from the inside in multiple places. 9 of the most experienced winter campers in the entire region. People who understood better than almost anyone alive just how quickly the cold could kill a human body had apparently taken a blade to their own shelter and fled out into a night where temperatures had dropped to somewhere around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. And they hadn't stopped to dress for it. Investigators found boots, warm coats, hats, and gloves still neatly inside the tent, untouched. Several of the hikers had fled in nothing but socks. Some were barefoot. Several wore only thin undershirts, light sweaters, shorts, or underwear. Clothing that made perfect sense for someone resting inside a sleeping bag at the end of a long day. And almost no sense at all for someone stepping outside into a Siberian blizzard. Whatever had driven this group out of their tent, it had happened with a speed and a terror that left no time, and apparently no thought, for proper clothing. These weren't people calmly deciding to step out and check on a strange noise. These were people running. And yet, here's where the case takes its first deeply strange turn. Searchers followed a long trail of footprints leading away from the ruined tent, down the slope and toward a dense line of trees more than a kilometer below. If 9 people had genuinely bolted from their shelter in blind panic, you would expect exactly what panic produces. A chaotic scatter of footprints heading in different directions, people stumbling, doubling back, losing each other in the dark. That isn't even close to what the trackers found. The footprints were calm, orderly, close together, evenly spaced, moving in a single line down the mountainside, as though the group had organized itself and walked deliberately, step by step, even as the freezing air tore into their bare skin and bare feet. Whatever had sent them running from that tent, it hadn't shattered the bond between them. Somehow, in the middle of what must have been one of the most terrifying nights of their lives, 9 people had managed to stay together and move as one unit, down more than a kilometer of frozen mountainside, in the dark, in their socks. For days afterward, that single eerie image was all investigators had to work with. An empty, slashed tent standing alone on an exposed slope, and a long trail of orderly footprints disappearing into a black tree line. The hikers themselves were still missing, somewhere out there in the snow. And when their bodies finally began to surface, first 2, then more, then the final, most disturbing discoveries months later, the mystery wouldn't get any easier to explain. The search itself in those early days was its own grim operation. Volunteers and soldiers worked in brutal conditions, often in temperatures nearly as punishing as the ones that had killed the hikers they were looking for, using dogs, sleds, and eventually aircraft to scour a landscape that offered almost nowhere to hide and almost nowhere to easily search. Inside the abandoned tent, searchers found something that, on its own, only deepened the confusion. The hikers' diaries, their cameras, their food, their boots, their warm outer layers. Everything a person would need to survive a long winter expedition was still sitting there, untouched, as if its owners had simply stepped out for a moment and never come back. Nothing about the scene suggested an argument, a struggle inside the tent, or any kind of internal conflict. Whatever had happened, it had come from outside. If anything, it was about to get a great deal harder. The first 2 bodies were found at the edge of the tree line, beneath the broken branches of an old, solitary cedar tree. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, the 2 lifelong friends who'd shared a first name and years of hiking history, were discovered close to the remains of a small, dying fire. It wasn't much of a fire, just a handful of burnt branches snapped down from the lower limbs of the cedar above them. And those limbs told their own story. The bark, several meters up the trunk, was scraped and broken, as if someone had climbed that tree in a hurry, possibly to get a better vantage point over the dark woods around the camp, to look for the rest of the group, or to look for whatever it was they were running from in the first place. Both men were dressed in almost nothing. Both had severe burns on their hands and feet, evidence that in their final, desperate hours, they had pressed themselves as close to that small fire as they possibly could, scorching their own skin in a futile attempt to hold off the cold that was already killing them. And both bore injuries that the original investigation struggled to fully explain. Doroshenko's body showed bruising across his torso, abrasions across his face, and, according to the original examination notes, a strange grayish fluid found near his mouth. A detail that hints at serious internal trauma to the chest, but which was never satisfactorily addressed in the official Soviet report. Krivonishenko, for his part, was found with a chunk of his own knuckle bitten through, perhaps an attempt to stay conscious through unbearable pain, or perhaps a final, silent way to keep himself from crying out in the dark. The official cause of death, recorded for both men, hypothermia. Simple, clean. A verdict that would repeat itself again and again over the coming months, even as body after body turned up with injuries that a textbook case of freezing to death simply doesn't produce. Roughly 300 meters further up the slope, closer to the direction of the ruined tent, searchers found their leader. Igor Dyatlov was lying on his back, both fists clenched tight, his face marked with cuts and bruises, missing an incisor. Wounds that an examining coroner would later describe as consistent with the kind of blunt trauma you'd see from a physical fight. Not far from him lay Zinaida Kolmogorova, partially dressed in clothing that clearly hadn't started out as her own. One sleeve of her sweater torn, with a long bruise along her side that some investigators compared to the mark of a blunt, club-like strike. Both of them appeared to have been trying to climb back up toward the tent, toward safety, toward shelter, toward their friends, when the cold finally caught up to them, and they collapsed. Nearly a week passed before the next body was located. 23-year-old Rustem Slobodin was found face down, partially buried in snow, with internal bleeding in both temples and a significant fracture across his skull. Whatever caused that injury, medical examiners concluded that Slobodin likely survived it for as long as an hour afterward. Conscious, disoriented, increasingly unable to control his own body before hypothermia finished what the head injury had started. It would be early May, months later after the spring thaw had finally begun loosening its grip on the mountain, before the final 4 hikers were found. They were buried beneath several meters of snow in a ravine, in a creek bed, beneath the remains of a den the survivors had clearly dug with their bare hands in a last, desperate bid to get below the wind and the worst of the cold. And it was here, with these final 4 bodies, that the case stopped looking like a tragic accident and started looking like something investigators and amateur researchers ever since have never been able to fully explain. Lyudmila Dubinina's body showed catastrophic internal injuries, multiple broken ribs and severe hemorrhaging in the right side of her heart. Semyon Zolotaryov, found near her, had strikingly similar trauma, a flail chest with several ribs broken along one side. According to the medical examiners who later studied these injuries, the force required to cause this kind of internal damage was comparable to the impact of a car crash. And yet, on both bodies there wasn't a single mark on the skin above the brakes. No bruising, no external lacerations, no surface trauma at all to account for internal damage that severe. It was as if some enormous crushing force had been applied to their chests without ever leaving a mark on the outside. A detail that, to this day, has never been fully or convincingly explained by any single theory researchers have proposed. It gets stranger still. Dubinina was missing her tongue, both of her eyes, part of her lips, and soft tissue around one cheek, exposing bone beneath. Zolotaryov, too, was missing both of his eyes. Whether this was the work of scavenging animals, the slow effects of months spent in melting snow and running creek water, or something else entirely, remains a genuinely disputed point among researchers even now. though traces of blood discovered in Dubinina's stomach strongly suggest that she was still alive, at least for some period of time after sustaining the worst of her injuries. The final 4 hikers had clearly fought to survive far longer than anyone expected. They had stripped clothing from the bodies of their dead friends found earlier and layered it over their own threadbare garments in a grim, practical attempt to outlast the cold just a little longer. And on these scavenged clothes, the very items the last survivors had used to try to stay alive. Investigators later detected something nobody had anticipated: trace levels of radiation, measurably above normal background levels. To this day, nobody has offered a fully satisfying account of where that radiation came from. When all 9 deaths were finally tallied and the case officially closed, the conclusions were a strange, uneasy mix. 6 deaths were ruled hypothermia, in keeping with the freezing conditions. 2, Dubinina and Zolotaryov, whose internal injuries simply couldn't be reconciled with a textbook cold weather death, were ruled to have died from what investigators called, almost apologetically, an unknown compelling force. A phrase that was strange and unsatisfying when it was written in 1959, and remains exactly as strange and unsatisfying today. Sit with the full list of what was found, all together, for a moment. A tent slashed open from the inside. Experienced hikers fleeing barefoot into a deadly cold. An orderly single-file march down a mountainside instead of a panicked scatter. Catastrophic internal injuries with no matching external wounds. Missing eyes. Traces of radiation on clothing taken from the dead. The Soviet investigation closed within months of the bodies being recovered. The case files were quietly sealed. The area around Kholat Syakhl was declared off-limits to hikers for the following 3 years, and the grieving families were left with almost no real explanation for what had happened to their children. It would be decades, long after the fall of the Soviet Union, before journalists, independent researchers, and amateur investigators from around the world finally gained meaningful access to the case files. And once they did, the theories began to multiply, each one trying and ultimately failing to account for every single piece of this puzzle at once. More than 60 years on, the Dyatlov Pass incident remains, officially and unofficially, unsolved. At least in any way that accounts cleanly for every piece of physical evidence left behind on that mountain. That hasn't stopped people from trying, though. If anything, the sheer strangeness of the case has only fueled more theories over time, not fewer. Here are the explanations that have endured the longest in public imagination, and, importantly, the specific reasons each one still falls short of explaining everything. The earliest theory to circulate blamed the Mansi people, the indigenous tribe whose traditional hunting grounds included the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. Investigators discovered a sacred structure not far from the campsite, and for a time suspicion grew that the hikers had unknowingly trespassed onto land that wasn't theirs, provoking a violent response from people protecting their territory. It's an understandable early guess, but it falls apart under scrutiny. That sacred structure turned out to be tied to a moose sacrifice, an entirely separate ritual practice, not anything resembling an attack on outsiders. There has never been any physical evidence placing Mansai hunters anywhere near the campsite that night. And critically, this theory does nothing whatsoever to explain the crushed ribs with no external bruising, the missing eyes, or the radiation found on the clothing. In hindsight, it looks less like a real investigative lead, and more like an easy, convenient place to direct blame in the absence of any better explanation. Today, it's almost universally dismissed by serious researchers. A second, far more enduring theory points to an avalanche. This became, for many years, something close to the official mainstream explanation, especially after a widely publicized 2021 study used modern slab avalanche modeling to argue that even a small, slow-moving slide could have struck the tent hard enough to cause blunt force trauma to the people sleeping inside. It's a tidy theory in some respects. It would explain the panic, the cut tent, the rush to flee without proper clothing. But it runs into serious problems the moment you look closer. No avalanche debris was ever found at the scene by the original search teams. The slope's angle at the campsite is considered relatively mild by the standards typically associated with slab avalanche releases. And perhaps most damning of all, An avalanche powerful enough to crush ribs and fracture skulls should, by any reasonable expectation, leave obvious bruising, lacerations, and surface trauma on the bodies it struck. And again, across multiple autopsies, that kind of external damage simply was not present. A third theory, more psychological in nature, centers on a phenomenon called infrasound. Extremely low-frequency sound waves, often generated when wind moves across certain rounded terrain features, that some researchers believe can produce intense, irrational panic, nausea, and a feeling of inexplicable dread in human beings, even without being consciously heard as sound at all. The theory holds that wind moving across the smooth shoulder of Kholat Syakhl that night generated exactly this kind of infrasound. And the hikers, gripped by a wave of sudden, overwhelming, biologically triggered terror, tore open their tent and fled without thinking. It's a genuinely compelling idea on the surface. There's real science behind infrasound's effects on the human nervous system, but it asks us to accept that 9 trained, experienced, level-headed outdoors people, several of whom had weathered far worse storms together over the years without losing their composure, would all simultaneously and completely lose control of their judgment at exactly the same moment, with not one of them pausing even to grab a coat. And like the avalanche theory, it offers nothing at all to explain the internal injuries, the missing eyes, or the radiation. A fourth theory leans on a real, well-documented medical phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, a symptom that can occur in the final, most severe stages of hypothermia, where a dying brain misfires so badly that it convinces the body it's overheating rather than freezing, triggering an urge to strip off clothing. It's tempting to apply this directly to the case, given how underdressed several of the hikers were found. But paradoxical undressing typically occurs at the very end of the hypothermic process, in the last stage of dying, not at the very beginning of an ordeal. And the evidence at the scene tells a very different story than confused, dying people randomly shedding clothes. The fire built beneath the cedar tree, the climbed tree itself, clothing deliberately stripped from the dead and redistributed among the surviving members of the group. These are the actions of people actively, rationally fighting to survive as long as possible, not people in the terminal confusion of freezing to death. Then there are the theories that refuse to go away precisely because the case itself refuses to make sense by ordinary standards. One holds that the group was caught in the fallout or blast radius of a secret Soviet weapons test, a rocket, a chemical or radiological trial conducted somewhere in the surrounding wilderness, an area the military was known to use for exactly this kind of testing during the Cold War. This theory draws support from a disputed claim made by a member of the original search party, who reported finding boot prints belonging to military-style footwear mixed in among the hikers' own trail. Prints that don't belong to any of the 9. Another version of this theory goes even further, suggesting a direct, violent encounter between the hikers and Soviet military personnel operating in the area, an encounter the state would have had every incentive to cover up completely. And then, for those willing to go furthest of all, there's the photograph. Among the recovered cameras belonging to the group was one severely damaged by water and time, found on Zolotaryov's body. When the film was eventually developed, despite the extensive damage, one frame appeared to show a strange, indistinct light or shape in the night sky above the camp. An image open to wildly different interpretations depending entirely on who's looking at it. Some see camera malfunction or simple light damage from sitting in melting snow for 3 months. Others see something else entirely and have pointed to local Mansi hunters who, separately, reported strange glowing lights in the sky above the pass that same week. None of these later, stranger theories fully explain everything either. No single explanation ever has, in over 60 years of people trying. But it's worth remembering something important about how this case was originally handled. The Soviet investigation was buried for nearly 3 years before any of its findings were made public, reopened only under outside pressure, and ultimately closed with a vague, unsatisfying ruling. An unknown compelling force that explained essentially nothing and answered no one, least of all the families who had to live the rest of their lives without real answers. Whatever the Soviet authorities knew, suspected, or deliberately chose not to investigate further, they left behind a case file riddled with gaps. And in a story already this strange, every one of those gaps has become fertile ground for a new generation of theories to take root. It's also worth noting that this case has never fully stopped being investigated. In 2019, Russian authorities formally reopened the file, citing pressure from victims' relatives who, even 6 decades on, still wanted real closure. That renewed investigation ultimately landed back on a version of the avalanche theory, framing it as the most scientifically defensible explanation available with modern modeling tools. But plenty of independent researchers, including some who have spent literal decades on this case, remain unconvinced, pointing to the same unresolved problems that have dogged the avalanche theory from the very beginning. The missing debris, the mismatched injuries, the total absence of external bruising on bodies that supposedly endured car crash-level internal trauma. An official reopening, it turns out, isn't the same thing as an official answer. What we're left with, well over 6 decades later, is this. 9 people died on a mountain the Mansi people had already been calling dead for generations before any of this happened. They fled their only shelter in a shared, sudden desperation severe enough to make them cut their way out with a knife rather than waste even seconds at the entrance. They walked down that mountain together, deliberately, rather than scatter in panic. They fought. With fire, with a climbed tree, with clothing stripped from the bodies of friends, to survive as long as they possibly could. And in the end, they succumbed to injuries that, even now, with modern forensic science and 6 decades of dedicated research behind us, still don't have a single explanation that accounts for all of them at once. Maybe it really was the mountain. Geography and weather conspiring in some rare, freak combination science hasn't fully mapped out even now. Maybe it was the cold itself, working on 9 different minds in 9 different, equally terrible ways. Or maybe the real answer is sitting in a file somewhere, in an archive in Russia, never meant to be found by anyone outside a small circle of people who already know exactly what happened that night. What's certain, more than 60 years later, is only this. Igor Dyatlov never sent that telegram, and Dead Mountain has never told us why.